Hello, thank you for joining this webinar on strategic planning for early stage community land trusts. So I'm going to start with Strategic Planning 101 and then get into some specific approaches for conducting strategic planning. So what is a strategic plan? People often talk about writing a strategic plan, but strategic planning is not just about the output, which is often a report. The process is just as, if not more important. It's a process that enables your organization to define strategies or objectives over a period of time, usually 3 to 5 years, and based on that, decide how you can use the resources at your disposal to achieve your strategic goals. But it's not just that. It's, as Judy with PNLT put it, an enactment of your values to work towards your vision. And as Dominique from KMCLT put it, the strategic plan happens in a balance of what you dream of and where you are politically. And I'll get into the kind of political aspects of it in a bit. Now, people often get strategic plans mixed up with other kind of forms of reports that you might develop. Each kind of report here is asking a different sort of question. So a feasibility study is asking, is it possible to do what we're aiming to do, and what are the opportunities and constraints? A needs assessment might ask what land-based needs are evident in our area and who's experiencing those needs and what is being done to address them. And a business plan will ask, how will we as an organization remain financially viable and what projects are possible? Meanwhile, a strategic plan is asking what big picture strategies will help us achieve our vision, and how can we tangibly work towards making our vision a reality given our context. So why would you develop a strategic plan? What's the point of strategic planning? Most CLTs in Canada actually don't have explicit completed strategic plans. It's not an absolute requirement, but most will have done one of the previously mentioned plans or studies that kind of underpin and guide their work. As Dominique with KMCLT put it, every organization has a strategic plan. It's just a matter of whether or not it's explicit. And it's helpful to make it explicit. Those who founded your CLT might all be on the same page about what your kind of guiding principles and plans are, but it's still helpful to make your strategies explicit so you have something to work from. What's in your head is hard for others to engage with. So it's useful to avoid kind of assumptions about what those strategies are and instead kind of put pen to paper. It can also help hold your CLT accountable to its values. Otherwise, it can be easy to stray from your kind of underpinning values without a plan. It can help you maintain the big picture view of your CLT's vision. Again, otherwise you can get caught up in the sort of day-to-day details of what you're trying to do and not have a clear sight of what you're working towards. Having a strategic plan can also encourage or inform new members as well as staff. So again, your original CLT leaders might know exactly what your focus is and might have a good understanding of that because they developed it. But what about when you bring new people on board? How do you communicate your strategies and priorities to them? This is especially useful when you get to the point of hiring staff or bringing on contractors. Having a strategic plan enables them to work more independently without constantly having to check with the board for direction. It can also help you communicate your competence to external stakeholders. Having a strategic plan or other form of explicit plan shows funders, government bodies, etc., that you know what you're doing. And it's a plan that's supported by your members and widely backed. It also can help you ensure strategic use of limited resources. It's a way of prioritizing. There's a lot that you want to do and that you could do, but what do you need to do first to enable later activities? This sort of planning will help you make those decisions. So when, as a new or relatively new CLT, should you be creating a strategic plan? I asked this question to a number of practitioners and people who have experience with strategic planning, and they pretty much all said you should ideally create one as soon as you have the capacity. But it could be a while before you get to that point, hence why a lot of CLTs don't do it or don't do it right away. Your first strategic plan will be a bit different than later strategic plans. It will typically focus on capacity building, and you can, if you're doing a kind of early stage strategic plan, you can do it as part of your visioning, developing values, developing your mission, all of those things that can all be done kind of in one kind of package. Developing the strategic plan can also be part of early stage capacity building itself. So will help you build capacity to make decisions, to make a plan, and will help you decide your next steps. That's part of the capacity building. People have different views on whether or not you should do a strategic plan before a business plan. It really depends on your context. So if you have an immediate opportunity for a capital project, like a land donation from the municipality or property that needs to be preserved in your neighborhood, you might need to do business planning first to show the powers that be that you can financially manage the project, because business planning is really more about that financial piece of it. But if you don't have an immediate capital project, it's generally going to be better to do a strategic plan first. And as part of your strategic plan, you can say, okay, we need to figure out financial sustainability, financial feasibility of projects, and develop a business plan. That can be one of the kind of activities that's outlined in your strategic plan. So to give an example, Kensington Market Community Land Trust, they emerged from the Friends of Kensington. There was already a strong group of board members and key supporters that were values aligned and had implicit strategies guiding their work. And this worked for them in the early stages of the CLT. They received a time-sensitive acquisition opportunity that they found to be in line with their priorities, and they managed to successfully acquire a property with commercial and rental units. But following this acquisition, they hired their first member of staff, or just before the acquisition, and they found they needed to strategically plan to figure out next steps, priorities, and how to balance expansion with stewardship and community engagement. And at that point, they found that it was necessary to make an explicit strategic plan. So what goes into the actual strategic plan, the report itself, if you do write it out as a report? I'm going to talk about what's typically in strategic plans, but don't get overly hung up on this. There's no legislated requirement to have anything specific in your strategic plan. This can be used however you think you should use it. The point is to create something that works for your group and for whoever your key audiences are. So the main pieces typically will be background. This can be things like your organization's history, the rationale for your organization, the social, political, economic context you're working within. And then you'll typically get into your guiding principles, whatever those might be. So your mission, vision, values are the typical ones. It could be purpose. And then you have the kind of meat of it, which is the strategic objectives or strategic priorities. These are high-level objectives, typically one for kind of each main chunk of work. And for each, you'll have related outcomes, actions, supporting strategies, goals, whatever they might be, the kind of underpinning pieces of that. Final piece, which is often an appendix to your plan, is implementation and monitoring. So that will typically be an implementation plan, which is a sort of typical action plan type thing, with who's responsible for each task, the date by which you want to complete it, any other kind of resource implications. And you'll also typically have a plan for monitoring and updating your strategic plan as well. So again, don't get too hung up on this. I'm including it because some people ask for this sort of thing and might find it helpful, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed by all of these pieces, because really all you need is, your vision, your goals, and your action plan. But typically in a report, a kind of full written report version of a strategic plan, you'll have an executive summary, background, mission, vision, values, as I mentioned, maybe some information about your program areas, and then your goals and strategic objectives, then monitoring and implementation. These can be in a different order. You can customize it however you want. This is kind of just based on some other plans, how you might structure it to give you a starting point. And what focus areas will there be for a typical startup strategic plan, which, as I mentioned earlier, will look a little bit different than later stage strategic plans? This has been adapted from Neighborhood Land Trust's first strategic plan, which was really a capacity building strategic plan for them. The main focus areas might include admin and governance, community education and engagement, land acquisition and management, and fundraising and financial sustainability. And I have kind of particular things that might fall under these different focus areas here. And you can kind of organize these around different strategies or different priorities, but these are tasks that you might have included in your plan. So now to get into the process of strategic planning, not just kind of the plan itself. These are the typical steps for developing a strategic plan. The first step is planning, so setting roles for the strategic planning and gathering relevant internal information. The next step is brainstorming. That can be visioning, brainstorming, strategizing activities to identify main objectives and develop analysis. This might happen over multiple sessions, multiple workshops, or over a weekend-long retreat with main kind of stakeholders for your CLT. Then you'll want to work on filling in the gaps. So researching precedents, opportunities, and constraints that might influence what you're able to do. Then you'll get into drafting and soliciting broad feedback. Then finalizing, which might include seeking approval of the board and or membership. And then finally mobilizing. So that includes implementing monitoring procedures, sharing key takeaways with external audiences, etc. So I want to talk a bit about strategic planning and political analysis. Some groups and some people will connect with this more than others based on the kind of political leanings and values of your CLT. But I think it's really important because political analysis is part of what differentiates a CLT's strategic plan from a corporate strategic plan. What it is really an understanding of power, a sort of scrappiness and willingness to understand and shift power relations. This approach to strategic planning draws heavily on social movement theory, which is the theory of how social change happens through organizing. It might sound a bit academic, a bit kind of up in the air, but it's actually full of useful approaches and ideas. Social movement theory, essentially is about trying to make something happen that the powers that be don't want to see happen. And you kind of need to think in those terms. This will apply if you kind of see your CLT as being about some kind of fundamental social shift and change, rather than just a kind of common sense approach to solving the housing crisis. Political analysis will enable your organization to do a number of really useful things. That includes identifying key relationships, whether that be with political actors, organizers, or institutions, understanding your CLT's work in the context of broader socio-political forces. It's a recognition that nothing emerges in a vacuum. You're a product of and working within your particular moment, and it's helpful to understand what that means for you. It'll also help you anticipate and adapt to changing political priorities. So I said it's not just about electoral politics, but this is part of it. If you know that a new mayor or, say, prime minister is coming, what can you predict about what that will mean? How will you adapt to the changing policy environment, whether negative or positive? And finally, political analysis enables you to develop a strategic approach to community organizing and advocacy. This requires understanding the current state of things and then being smart about how you can work to change things for the better. Two ideas that come to us from social movement theory are conjunctural possibilities and structural constraints. You don't have to use these terms. You can make them more kind of accessible, but I think they're useful ideas. Conjunctural possibilities are, conjunction means the intersection of forces. So these are opportunities that arise because of a combination of forces and political conditions. For example, what opportunities present themselves when you have a mayor who's interested in affordable housing and significant media attention on the problems of renters? These will always be kind of a shifting target, but understanding what these forces are and how they might change and interact will help you understand what is possible to achieve currently. And then structural constraints are these kind of broader, more embedded in our society ideas and forces. Like, for example, the fact that housing is treated as a commodity in our society. And this is something that's supported by basically all of our political and financial institutions. It's not necessarily something that we can change in the short term, but how do we do our work within that and also gradually chip away at it in a way that will provide more opportunities in the future? So when I was thinking about how to talk about political analysis, the serenity prayer popped into my head, the one that goes, I have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And that almost gets at this idea of understanding political constraints and working within them, but I like Calvin's version better. He says, know what I pray for, the strength to change what I can, the inability to accept what I can't, and the incapacity to tell the difference. I think this is really instructive for CLTs because most groups, as they're starting out, will find that the conditions that for enabling their CLT to thrive don't exist yet. They need to create those conditions in order to do their work the way that they want to do it. So while you should be strategic and recognize constraints, you also need to be a bit audacious and work to change and shift seemingly immovable forces to an extent. Easy, right? So I want to talk about a couple different approaches to strategic planning that some groups like to use, particularly if they're thinking in terms of political analysis. One is called naming the moment, and this dates back to the 1980s. It was developed by a Canadian named Deborah Barnt, and she explains it this way. A given moment, this moment, is unlike any other moment in time. How can we understand what it offers so that we can make the best use of it? How have people used moments in the past to push toward greater social justice? So that's basically what naming the moment is, a method used to understand constraints and opportunities, how they've changed over time, and how to strategically achieve your goals within that. It's not an approach for writing a strategic plan specifically, but it can be used for that. It's also used for coalition building, other forms of social movements and activism, and broad-based campaigns. There are kind of 4 key phases to this: identifying ourselves and our interests, naming the issues and struggles, assessing the forces, and planning for action. It's a long process with a lot of different methods that can be used within it. It's more kind of an approach than a specific method. And you can read this guide that I linked to here. It's quite fun and informative, and it really speaks to the specific political moment that progressives were facing in the 1980s in Canada, which is quite fun to read through as well. So in the guide, you'll see a lot of examples of the process of naming the moment in practice, including a lot of useful diagrams and illustrations. So on the left here, we have the outcome of a free space exercise. They talk about free space as being the room for action within the present moment, what is historically possible to do at this point in time, and kind of the possibilities found within constraints. So you can read through how they've kind of conceived of that within their current possibilities and constraints. And then on the right here is what they call a political weather report. This is kind of explicitly naming events that help and hurt. And this is specific to anti-NAFTA activism, interestingly. But basically, you're listing events recently that have had an impact on your goals, and then thinking about what will change and what will help or hurt your overall goals. Another approach to strategic planning is the theory of change. This can be done along with or as part of naming the moment. Basically, this explains how a group of early and intermediate accomplishments set the stage for producing long-range results. It's both an approach and an output, which I'll show you in a moment. This approach enables groups to draw connections between their activities, the measurable outputs of those activities, and short and long-term social change. It involves 4 steps again: identifying goals, identifying necessary strategies and activities, linking strategies to outcomes and goals, and testing logic, reviewing and analyzing external forces. So I know this sounds a little bit abstract, but it's actually quite a tangible output, which I'll show you. These are 2 separate diagrams, one on the left, one on the right. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has a bunch of free resources and templates for theory of change work, and these are 2 of the possible types of diagrams you could create to illustrate your CLT's theory of change. So on the left, you see the strategy at the top with relevant activities, and then the various outcomes and how they're linked, and then the final goal. The right example is similar but kind of flipped. So you have the relevant activities on the left, strategies on the left, leading to near-term outcomes, interim outcomes, and then finally long-term outcomes and the goal at the bottom here. And here's an example from a Canadian CLT. This is part of the Neighbourhood Land Trust Strategic Plan 2021 to 2025. They link who we are to what we do, the activities, to the outputs, to the short-term outcomes, and then finally to their intended long-term impact. So now, taking a step back and thinking about strategic planning more broadly again, how can you as a CLT engage your broader community or your formal membership in the process? There are a few common ways that you can do this. So the first would be to involve them from the get-go. This is more common if you're a very early stage group and you're still working to get buy-in and engagement from the community, especially if you don't have a formal membership yet or an elected board. In this case, you might want to do workshops, community education sessions, focus groups, etc., with key stakeholders to set the CLT's vision and values and to kind of figure out the key strategies that follow logically from that vision and those values. One dilemma that you'll have to resolve for yourselves is that some communities might want to be involved from the start, but it can actually be quite challenging to ask people to engage if you don't have something semi-tangible for them to provide feedback on. So it really depends on the context you're working within and what people's preferences are, but you could start with a kind of outline or draft and then use that to get feedback in kind of subsequent sessions. You can then present the final or semi-final version for validation at members' meetings if you have a membership. You can also bring the plan to membership for some kind of formal approval. This is not necessary, but it's because you usually will just, need the board's approval, but it could be a good way of getting broader buy-in. You could also keep the membership engaged by reporting regularly, maybe quarterly or annually, on progress and on any updates to the plan. And then you can mobilize the plan to engage new members, basically showing them what you're up to and why your work is valuable. Another consideration is whether you want to work with a consultant to develop your strategic plan. So from the CLT practitioners I spoke to, most said that it's generally recommended to have someone external supporting the process, particularly to facilitate activities. It can be really helpful to have an external facilitator who can guide everyone through the process. It's also good to have someone who's experienced in facilitation and strategic planning. If you already have someone on your team who has that kind of experience, they could do it as well. But of course, you're going to want them to be able to take themselves out of the process a little bit in order to facilitate. It also really is going to depend on whether or not you can secure resources to hire a consultant, right? Because that's expensive. This is very much something you can apply for grants for. It's fairly easy to scope and also to show the impact and output for a funder, but that's not always going to be possible or even desirable. You also want to think about what consultant you're going with. So you want to choose the right consultant for your group. Do you want someone more experienced in kind of corporate, apolitical strategic planning, or someone with an understanding of grassroots organizing and social movements? These will be quite different approaches. A number of CLTs, I should mention, have worked with SHS Consulting. They also often will choose a local consultancy, someone who has knowledge of the local area. So it's really up to you what priorities you want to include in this choice. In order to hire a consultant, you might issue an RFP, a request for proposals, which ideally would include some background on your group, the desired output from the project, and the desired level of engagement from between the consultant and your CLT and broader community. It's important that even if you're working with a consultant and they're leading the project, you're bringing the right internal and external stakeholders to the table based on your knowledge of your community. So let's talk briefly about outputs for your strategic plan. People think of a strategic plan as just the report, but there are a number of different ways you can communicate your strategies. And the way you choose to communicate it should really depend on who your key audience or audiences are. So it's good practice to identify your audiences and then think about what you want to show or prove to them, and from that figure out what output works for that. So for your internal stakeholders, your board and your staff, they need a clear articulation of priorities and their own responsibilities within that. And they need strategies communicated in a way that will help them in making decisions. So they'll probably want to see the full report, but also specific implementation and monitoring plans, which I'll mention again in a moment. Thinking about the broader membership and others in your community, they might want some background on your group and a clear articulation of your values, vision, and priorities. It might not be necessary to show the whole detailed plan. That could be kept internal if you'd like. You could also do other media formats, so that could be a video, an infographic, things that make it easier to kind of consume and understand and also share on social media if you're trying to bring more people on board. This could be useful for a membership drive or soliciting donations. And then thinking about the external stakeholders, funders, or government bodies, you want to show them evidence that your CLT is being measured and considered in its decision-making and that you're moving towards longer-term goals. Basically, you're showing your competence, like I mentioned earlier. So for them, usually an executive summary will be enough. They won't read the whole thing. Most people won't. But it can be a useful addition to grant applications. And you could also use language from the strategic plan for your grant applications as well, kind of like pull that language and help you save time. So once you have your strategic plan, then what? It's supposed to be practical and useful as well as kind of pie in the sky and dreamy, right? So it's good practice, as I mentioned before, to have an implementation plan with dates, leads identified, and in a format that's easy to update and share. So that could be, Excel, a Google Sheet, or project management software, something that'll help save you time down the road as you report on progress. You'll also want to be sure that the strategic plan is cohesive with other plans, so you can use it as the basis for staff work plans or job advertisements. You can also use it as the basis for committee work plans and committee terms of references. It's also good practice to keep yourselves accountable with regular reviews of progress against whatever kind of key performance indicators you've identified. This could be in the form of a report from staff to the board, if you have staff, or someone from the board or a subcommittee of the board could be responsible for leading on this. This is also an opportunity to identify and keep track of changing conditions that might enable or limit action. And then you can adjust your strategic plan as needed. But don't be overly quick to change the bigger picture items in the plan. It might just be that, new opportunities come up or previous things that you planned on doing are no longer possible. So just kind of stay on top of those sorts of things and update as needed. And then ideally, you'll start reviewing your strategic plan around a year or 6 months prior to the end of the plan period. And you can use the existing plan as a starting point for your next plan. You want to figure out what you accomplished, what's changed, what's possible that wasn't before, and so on. And this is also a good opportunity, a good chance to brag about everything that you've accomplished, because sometimes people don't do enough of that. So to conclude, I want to share how one CLT has used strategic plans throughout the course of its development. And I'm sorry I keep mentioning PNLT, but they, more than any other Canadian CLT, have really used strategic plans to move themselves along. So PNLT was formed in 2012 to 2014. That's what they now call their exploration phase. Basically, this was the period where they were deciding in broad strokes that they wanted to create a CLT, and they were creating basic structures for the CLT. And then they developed their first strategic plan, 2015 to 2020, that carried them through the two subsequent phases, capacity building and demonstration phase. By the end of the capacity building phase, they had good organizational structures and processes in place, so in terms of admin, financial, legal, and they'd started building a team. They had good capacity within their board and membership, they had necessary policies, and they'd started planning capital projects. And the demonstration phase was about taking on their first acquisition projects and becoming a CLT with a land-based portfolio to start stewarding. After that, they developed a new 5-year strategic plan to cover their growth phase. They're still in this phase now, but basically this is about going beyond piloting approaches to improving processes, growing their portfolio, developing new housing, strengthening partnerships, and adapting to growth. So this is just one example of how you could use strategic plans to both guide your CLT's growth and to keep track of it. Now, because they've done this, they can look back and easily see what they've done, revisit their early stage vision and strategies, and stay true to those. I have linked a number of resources here that you can see in the slides. Thank you so much for watching.